What up, y'all? It's Dev. SVMTG, we like it in Magic, and today we're going to do the most popular thing on the YouTube. We're going to look at some unsolved cases, because it is a true crime, hey, that these decks haven't gotten a little bit more recognition. And bonus, I think, here, I get to put the word unsolved in the YouTube tags and the title. I'm curious to see how that affects the metrics, but one way or the other, Standard kind of slogging a little bit right now, you know? At the very beginning of Kamigawa Standard, it seemed like a brand new day. It felt fresh. Mid-range is back. We can build anything. What about these stupid, uncommon 4-mana enchantments that don't do anything when they come into play? Can we play those? No? Alright, well, let's try some other stuff. And a bunch of stuff worked. We got a completely different looking meta than we had just a few weeks ago before Kamigawa came out. That said, we all play a lot of Magic now. So Standard gets a little stale no matter what it looks like. And I love Standard, especially more than I did just a couple of months ago at least. But even I can only play against so many Orzhov control decks and Nihilrunes decks. God, those are everywhere now. Before I think to myself, gee, Willikers, I sure wish that more people would not play these decks. You can still play, some people can still play these decks, it's fine. But I wish that people would also play other decks. You don't have to play bad decks. I would never say that to you. I respect you. There's plenty of good decks out there that have been quietly doing really well in tournaments from time to time this season, and relatively consistently at that, but just haven't gotten the press that they deserve. And I think in a lot of cases that's because they haven't been fully solved yet. So today what we're going to do is look at 3 such decks that I think just need a few more eyeballs on them, a few more tweaks to be made to really achieve the pinnacle that they are supposed to achieve. With more people banging out games with these decks, maybe we can collectively, as a community with all of our heads together, figure out the optimal builds for these decks and maybe get the tournament results rolling in that these decks deserve. But with all that grandiosity out of the way, I'm a YouTuber. Let's go ahead and talk about deck number 1, Mardu Combo. Now, the Mardu deck has what we used to call steez back when I was a player. This deck is not like any other deck that you're going to see. Not just in this video or in Standard, but like in Magic. There are not a lot of decks just like this one. It can get a little bit weird because it has all these cards that you're just not going to see anywhere else. You know, we play Killian, Ink Duelist in our deck. We play Florian, Silver Quill Silencer. We play Hitotsugu in this deck. In some ways, this is a Hitotsugu deck, but in more ways, it is an Angel Fire Ignition deck, if you can believe it. It turns out Ignition is actually a fairly powerful card. A lot of opponents don't see it coming if they're tapped down or if they just don't have removal. They don't have cards in their hand or whatever. This card can just run people over starting as early as turn 3, but often on turn 4 after you cast your 3-drop. You'll start casting Angel Fire Ignitions, or maybe you cast your Killian on 2, and then on 3 you get a mana to do something, and you can Angel Fire Ignition. On turn 4 after your Killian, you can Angel Fire Ignition for 2 mana. Still have 2 up for an Aspirant or something. So this deck has a lot of like weird, wonky, early, to mid-game sort of curves, but it's not really that worried about curving out, because if the deck doesn't curve out the way it wants to, they can just leave an Angel Fire Ignition in its graveyard for a while. If it gets swept, then it can just play a creature, immediately Ignition, and hit the opponent. This is important considering how many sweepers are being played in the format right now. It's also important in how it lines up against certain planeswalkers like Lolth. Your opponent plays Lolth, they make 2 spiders. Well, you can just blow directly through that with an Angel Fire Ignition. Give the creature trample, and lifelink, and vigilance, and indestructible, and haste, which can be important. Again, especially after a sweeper, where you can draw directly into a Killian, say, and then immediately play an Angel Fire Ignition, and late in the game, you might have more mana open to do even more things. So the deck is really, really weird. Like super weird in that it mostly plays towards Angel Fire Ignition a lot of the game, but it's got a lot of other cool things that it can do. It's got Kaya's Onslaught, a card that you will see in no other Standard Magic decks. But this card, I said on Twitter the other week, this card plays an awful lot like Embercleave, especially in this deck, when you have Angel Fire Ignition to give the creature trample. So +1/+1/+1, trample, double strike. What does that sound like? That sounds like a better than Embercleave, because with Angel Fire Ignition, you're also getting lifelink, and vigilance, and indestructible. All things that Embercleave doesn't quite give you. So just a combination of Ignition and Onslaught with just about any creature in the deck. it can do some truly heinous things. But obviously, if you have a Hidetsugu on its backside, and it's got the, you know, if this deals 10 damage or more to a player in a turn, that player loses the game. If it's got that mode going on, then things like Onslaught and Ignition are incredible with it. But Onslaught and Ignition are still really good with cards like, say, Florian, right? Because Florian is going to be able to, let's say you play Florian on 3. On turn 4, you can cast an Angel Fire Ignition. You have a 5/5 first strike, trample, indestructible, lifelink vigilance guy that's going to swing, doesn't tap to swing or anything. Guaranteed 10-point life swing. Sometimes a creature jumps in front of it even though nobody has the chance to block it and kill it, because it has not only first strike, but more importantly, indestructible. So, you know, somebody might jump in front of it, but it can still trample over and end up leading to, you know, some card advantage on that turn, or maybe on a later turn if you have mana. And you play Angel Fire Ignition out of your graveyard with, say, a Killian in play. That only costs 2 mana. So then, Florian gets through for a bunch of trample lifelink damage. You get to look at a bunch of cards and select the best one and play it with all your extra mana. So the deck, again, has some really wonky angles from which it approaches things, but some things are just simple. You know, you go Luminarch Aspirant into Graveyard Trespasser, and then on turn 4, again, you just pump out your first Angel Fire Ignition on your Graveyard Trespasser. You swing for 5. That's a 10-point life swing with the lifelink and all that. It gets to stay up on blocks as a 5/5 because it's vigilant. And it also drains your opponent. And if your opponent wants to get rid of it, they have to discard a card. It's just very, very silly. Graveyard Trespasser also helps you get around the fact that, like, you know, if you play a creature on 3 into Angel Fire Ignition on 4, you might get your creature removed in response to playing Ignition. Graveyard Trespasser helps sort of mitigate those issues too. So a lot of cool stuff in this deck. Then there's a lot of tech to it as well. Showdown of the Skulls is cool for a lot of reasons. Obviously, Angel Fire Ignition gives the creatures trample after you cast it on them. So if you make one creature huge off of your Showdown triggers, then you can get through with trample. Hidetsugu, you can just pile it up with counters from Showdown of the Skulls, get it through with trample and lifelink, and win the game that way. So, Fable of the Mirror Breaker can copy any of these creatures, and it's amazing to see in this deck, but still good enough. It turns out quite good enough, especially with things like Luminarch Aspirant, Graveyard Trespasser getting extra triggers. So Reckless Stormseeker getting extra triggers off of that is dumb. So even just the one Fable makes plenty of sense. Aside from that, you've got solid removal like Vanishing Verse in this color combination, Valorous Stance to kill stuff or protect your dudes, Sejiri Shelter to protect your guys, again, after you Angel Fire Ignition or while you're trying to resolve Ignition. Seismic Wave is the newest technology in the deck. Very often this would be Path of Peril. In the early days of the format here, very often it was Path of Peril, but Seismic Wave does very similar things to that. Sometimes it can take out a larger target, kill all the small stuff, wedding announcement tokens, Lolth tokens, and stuff like that, without having all of the mana requirements of a spell like Path of Peril. So I think that's why we've made that sort of advancement in technology, but there's way more other advancements in technology the deck could make. One way or the other, though, I think this is one of the coolest decks that we'll look at, not just today, but basically in any video this season. And it's a weird one to wrap your head around, especially once you get into the arena with it. But I think it's well worth figuring out how to pilot. So let's take it back to Couch Dev to talk a little bit more about it. Altogether, there's a reason that I started with the Mardu deck. I love this deck because it's just really not like any other deck, almost in Magic history, to the point that it's difficult to describe what exactly it's trying to do. It's not quite a mid-range deck. It's not quite a combo deck, even though it's often labeled Mardu Midrange or Mardu Combo. It's kind of neither one of those things. And maybe if we have more pilots looking at this deck, grinding out more work hours with it, then eventually we'll have one experienced enough to actually get a world record speedrun going and smash a tournament with this deck, which I would love to see because it definitely deserves to do that. Just such a cool deck, but I'm not going to go on and on about that. We're going to go to deck number 2 now and talk about one that has a little bit more of a classic structure in terms of what we expect a mid-range deck to be. But this card has been trying to be important ever since it was first spoiled, really. Ever since we really got the first chance to play with this card, we have thought that one day it was going to be a force in Standard. And I think, especially with some recent tournament results, we have seen the return of Storm the Festival in Standard, but not quite to the level that puts it into the upper echelon, the top tiers of what we expect from this Standard right now. But I still think that Storm the Festival has a chance, so let's take a look at a deck. So let's take a look at this Bant Festival deck that went above 500 win percentage, a little over 50% at a recent small-ish tournament. But it's still a good one to look at because I think it has all the hallmarks of a Selesnya Storm deck. Now, it's only got 2 copies of Storm the Festival in it, which is, again, fairly standard for these decks as you see them. You don't want to play all the 6-drops in the world in your deck, plus you get to cast this card twice in some games if they go long. Games that do go long, you've got things like Farewell, good removal piece right now. Things like Starnheim Unleashed. You've got March of Otherworldly Light and Valorous Stance. Decent removal pieces right now. You've got Wedding Announcement to poop out tokens in longish games and make all your dudes bigger and stuff. And then you've got these haymakers like Essica's Chariot. You've got Ren and 7 in the deck. You've got the Wandering Emperor in the deck. And all of these can be hit by a Storm the Festival, but they're also just great on their own in a vacuum. We've got things like Tangled Florahedron and Prosperous Innkeeper to help us ramp into those things. A turn 3 Chariot, or a turn 4 Ren and 7. Turn 3 Wandering Emperor is also pretty decent a lot of the time. So in the early to mid game, this deck has access to a lot of really good plays that are a little bit ahead of schedule, but in case those don't put it ahead enough to put a game away, again, it's got things like Storm the Festival to get even more board presence kind of out of nowhere. Starnheim Unleashed to get a bunch of board presence, possibly after a sweeper if you foretold it early. Again, things like Farewell to reset the board state, and then you recast Storm the Festival the next turn out of your graveyard and get ahead on board state. This deck is either about getting ahead on board state in the early game, or if it has to, again, resetting the board state and getting ahead once it's done that. This is sort of your quintessential mid-range deck, even right down to the sideboard counterspells. That's a time-honored tradition in mid-range decks throughout Standard history, but even just in the main deck here, you see that you've got extremely powerful cards that even when played on curve can take a game over, like the Wandering Emperor, like Ren and 7. These cards help you turn the corner immensely. You can just do the old Essica's Chariot, Ren and 7, 1-2. You can copy, Vigilant 2/2s from the Wandering Emperor with your Essica's Chariot. So it's kind of a Selesnya tokens deck with all the Planeswalkers that make tokens, with the Wedding Announcement, with the Essica's Chariot, a lot of tokens going on, but it's also kind of a ramp deck that gets 4 and 5 drops a turn ahead of schedule because of all of our 2-drop ramp. But it's also a Storm the Festival deck, but it's also a control deck with, a reset sweeper and a couple of really good removal pieces. So a lot of dimensions to this deck, but it still kind of boils down to a very classic mid-range deck. Now, I will say that Storm is one of those decks that I do think needs some work in terms of how it tends to use its slots, mostly in terms of the balance between its spells, like Storm the Festival, removal like Fateful Absence occasionally, and sometimes you'll even see like Farewell in this deck, which is nuts to me that you would play multiple 6-drops, but you see people do it from time to time. A balance between those spells and the permanence the deck naturally has to play. Planeswalkers, creatures, and things that it can hit off of a Storm the Festival. There's that, and the fact that even though the deck is very powerful in terms of like the overall card quality in the deck, it's got a lot of those cool tricks. It can go Prosperous Innkeeper into either Chariot or Wandering Innkeeper. That's incredible. It can then go into Ren and 7 and start copying the Ren and 7 tokens with its Chariot. So it's got not only individually powerful cards, but very, very powerful synergies. And all of that is really good, obviously, but it's just not quite up to the same level of grind that decks like, say, Orzhov Tokens are up to right now, or Esper Planeswalkers. It kind of falls prey to being a normal mid-range deck. Even though a lot of its cards are very powerful, it doesn't really have all the depth. But now on to deck number 3, and in some ways, I am most excited to talk about this deck because I think that it is the most malleable of all the decks in the video today. Again, Mardu Combo, I think that deck list is more or less figured out, aside from maybe a flex slot or two here and there. Selesnya Combo has more flex slots than Mardu, but You want to be slotting in really powerful cards in that deck, and you don't care so much about synergy, so long as you can hit these cards off of a Storm the Festival. So the scope of cards that you can take out or put into the Selesnya deck is relatively small, but I do still think that deck needs tweaks. This deck, on the other hand, is almost completely open-ended. The possibilities are more or less endless. So let's talk for a bit about Shigeki Combo. Let's take a look at this Golgari Planeswalkers deck, is how it's labeled, by Graham Hayhurst here. Again, this went above 50% in a recent, smallish tournament, but still, everyone counts, right? This one does have the 4 copies of Wrenn and 7, the 3 copies of Lolth. You might expect to see Storm the Festival in this deck. But instead, they're employing the Shigeki Loop combo to help them grind out long games against decks like Orzhov and whatnot, right? Again, in case you haven't seen the combo, Shigeki, this card right here, can channel for multiple cards out of your graveyard, right? If I pay 6 mana, I get 2 cards out of my graveyard, and I discard Shigeki. Well, this deck plays Bala Ged Recovery. So with Bala Ged Recovery, I can cast that, get the Shigeki out of my graveyard, put it back in my hand. And then I can use the Shigeki to get back to Bala Ged Recovery and whatever else that I want to from my graveyard. So with that in mind, you can just loop Shigeki and Bala Ged Recovery over and over in this list. And there's various ways to do it. There's a couple of Golgari mid-range decks that place fairly well today that don't use Bala Ged Recovery or Colossal Sky Turtle. They instead use Harness Infinity to pull this little combo off. Even though you exile the Harness Infinity, still you can discard the Harness or mill the Harness in the early game, and then later on use Shigeki to get the Harness back, cast the Harness, get Shigeki back, and even if you only have to do that one time, it's still enough to win the game, right? So this deck and other decks like it tend to focus on being able to do the Shigeki loop multiple times, but now we're seeing these Harness Infinity decks with Shigeki that only do the loop once, but they end up getting a million cards out of it. So it tends to make a little bit of sense that way too. But I chose to look at this deck because it's a little bit different than a lot of the other decks. This is a Blood on the Snow deck. It's not a card that you see very often anymore, but I can understand why you'd prioritize Blood on the Snow in a 2-color Planeswalkers deck. It does still make sense. You can also use Bala Ged Recovery to get back your Planeswalkers if you need to. Invoke Despair is maybe one of the best cards in the format right now. I know that sounds weird. It doesn't see all the play in the world. It sees a lot more play on Arena than it does in larger scale tournaments. But again, not surprising to see Invoke in this deck. This person is playing an awful lot of 5-drops, but it's worth it to play what is sort of the casualties of war of this format. You've got things like Field Trip to not only learn, but help you ramp into it. Even in these best of 3 decks, we sometimes see learn in this format. Again, much more mid-range, much longer games in this format, so it's not uncommon now to see best of 3 decks play things like Field Trips. They go get a Mascox exhibition or something. So again, not too surprising, but things like Kazandu Mammoth and Egon are a little surprising. I can see using Throne of Death here as a 1-drop to help mill things into your graveyard. You can then get with Shigeki later or something, but I'm not sure that you actually have to play either one of these cards. There's probably better ways to use these slots. No offense to Graham Hayhurst here. I am surprised not to see things like Binding the Old Gods in this deck, which are incredible to get back with the Shigeki and also ramp you towards these bigger plays and stuff. So again, you often see these decks built in a different way, but that's one of the reasons I wanted to show this deck off, is to illustrate a completely different way in which it can be built. But again, you'll often see things like Asika's Chariot, which they're playing a 4 of. Wrenn and 7, Lolth, which they're playing 4 of. Now note that Shigeki can't get back legendary cards. That's kind of lame, but things like Bala Ged Recovery can, right? I think this is one of the reasons that people are skipping to Harness Infinity now. Because Harness Infinity just gets back everything in your graveyard, the legendaries, the lands, it doesn't really matter. Anything that you've milled, right? So that is much better in a lot of cases than a thing like Shigeki, which can't get back these Planeswalkers, but it can help you get back a Kazandu Mammoth. It can help you get back a Blood on the Snow, which is usually a blowout play because you get back the Blood on the Snow with the Shigeki, and then the Blood on the Snow is what gets back the Planeswalker for you. So Shigeki doesn't have to get back a legendary card. The card you get back with Shigeki will do that for you, right? So you can use Shigeki to continually loop Invoke Despairs, which is usually a game-winning thing to do, right? So there's a lot of cool stuff about decks like this. And again, even though this one is built a little differently than you normally see, this one still has the sort of classic loop ability. It supports cards like Wrenn and 7 and Lolth, right, with the ability to loop things like Blood on the Snow so your opponent can't keep creatures on the battlefield, Invoke Despair so that you win the Planeswalker War, and so forth and so on. Even, by the way, just using Invoke Despair once every couple of turns with the Shigeki Loops is good enough to kind of lock the opponent out on its own a lot of the time. I imagine that's how this deck is going to win the game some of the time. So I like this version of the deck, but there's a million different versions of the deck out there that play a lot of different really high utility green-black cards right now. And again, beyond. Sometimes you'll see Sultai or even Bant with this setup. Now, this can be a little weak against those Rite of Oblivions and the Vanishing Verses that some people are playing, obviously, because, you know, you might get your stuff exiled. That would suck. You can also get your whole graveyard exiled by a Farewell. So I think the best versions of this deck right now probably have to play blues so that they can counter spells. So I wouldn't be surprised to see this deck move back into Sultai, or again, maybe even Bant, where it's a fine deck. And then you get access to Sky Turtle, too. Well, I mean, I'm telling you, Sky Turtle's where you want to be with this deck, but one way or the other. We know what 6 to 8 of the slots in this deck are, but we really don't know what the other, 24 non-land slots are. But that's it for this one. Let me know what your Unsolved decks are down there in the comments section. I'm interested in this, because with every video that I do like this, there's going to be decks that, or cards or whatever, that people want me to mention, but I don't. So, what things did you want me to bring up in this video that maybe I didn't talk about? Aside from that, do the YouTube stuff. Just like, subscribe, share the video around if anybody still does that in the year 2022. And check out these things, twitch.tv, that's where I play Magic cards. And Patreon is where you can support me. It's just $1 a month to vote on content and such like that. That's why we're doing this video. And again, you can follow me on Twitter if you really want to. Not sure why you'd want to. I think I want this watermelon jelly bean more than anything in the world, so I'm going to do that. But anyway, I love you all. Thanks for sticking around to the end of this video. Make sure you answer the question of the day. I will catch you cats later. I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.